stay really nice and cool, because it sounds like it's going to get really hot. Okay, we have one card going around today only, our retirement card for Dennis Foy. So please, when it comes to you, just put a little note in, or just, you know, just something special for Dennis. He has certainly been a great friend to the Historical Society for many, many years, and it's just neat to remember him. I'm told that there's going to be a retirement party for Dennis Sunday from 1 to 4.
Right.
Is that right? Okay, at KMEQ radio station, right?
Right.
And there's going to be root beer floats.
Right.
And cups or glasses or some kind of souvenir that they're giving away. So it should be a good time, and if you can, stop by and just say hello to Dennis and wish him well. Richard.
Just to let everyone know, he's my godfather, and he is an asset to Macoken, and that station will be missed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no replacing Dennis. He's been around for a very long time. And a super neat guy. Alrighty. Brown bag lunch next week. I think I do know what it's going to be. I think. So I think since summer is kind of waning, we're going to take this opportunity and we're going to talk some more about circuses, circus people and performers that have been from Jackson County over the time. And we just touched on a couple when we talked about the post office and who we might like to meet at the post office. But there's a lot of stories about circus performers that were from Jackson County that just, you know, traveled the world with the circuses and just did some really remarkable things. So we've got some fun pictures, so it'll just be kind of a fun brown bag lunch. But we have a very important and serious brown bag lunch today. So Sue Mayberry is going to talk to us about Alexander Hamilton Willard. As you can see, we have had such neat programs in the past, maybe people associated with Lewis and Clark and their expedition, so it's really going to be fun to hear about this man and the things that he did, and how all of that kind of relates back to the way things were here back then. So I appreciate Sue for being willing to do brown bag lunches for us. She does a great job. And Sue Mayberry.
Here, go take my notes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Okay. Can you hear me? All right. So Alexander Hamilton Willard. I'm just going to kind of give you an overview first so that you can follow, because I'll be talking about different names just so you don't get, so I'm not making it too confusing for you. This focuses on Aurelia Peyton. And so we're going to be talking about the Peyton family. And then her maiden name was Shattuck. So we'll be talking about the Shattuck families. And then her first husband was Willard. And he was the son of Alexander Hamilton Willard. So, you know, that's clear as mud right now, but it'll be those three families, the Willard. And then, so Alexander Hamilton Willard's daughter-in-law was Aurelia Shattuck Peyton, or Peyton, Shattuck Peyton, and then that was her second marriage. So because his daughter-in-law lived here in Jackson County, with her first marriage, she did have 2 children. So his grandchildren were living in Jackson County, but then they moved away. But anyway, I do have some information on them as well. So Aurelia is buried in Sweezy Cemetery in Farmers Creek Township. And so this will focus on the Peyton family. And again, Aurelia is the daughter-in-law of Alexander Hamilton Willard, the explorer. Aurelia Amelia Shattuck married George Clark Willard in 1834. After her husband George was killed, guardianship of her 2 young sons, Ralph Clark Willard and Hamilton Alexander Willard, changed to her father-in-law, Alexander Hamilton Ward. After Aurelia remarried, guardianship of the Willard children changed to the new stepfather, Stephen W. Payton. 2 Payton children were born to Aurelia and Stephen in Illinois, and 4 more in Jackson County, before Aurelia died at age 36. Aurelia was about 19 or 20 years old and already a widow, left with 2 little boys, less than 2 years old. Many articles about her husband's death were published. A Galena newspaper article quotes, "The citizens of this county have been much excited by the late atrocious murder of Mr. George Willard, a justly esteemed and worthy member of society, cut off in the bloom and vigor of manhood by the assassin hand of one Lyndon B. McCumber, late a deserter from the U.S. Army and Fort Winnebago, and formerly an inmate of the Sing Sing prison of New York. Since then, McCumber has confessed the murder, and though he heard the heart-rending sighs of the bereaved parents, sisters, and brothers, and the piercing screams of the inconsolable wife, yet he was perfectly unmoved." Sing Sing Prison opened in 1826. It was considered a model prison because it turned a profit for the state. They imposed absolute silence on the prisoners. The system was enforced by whipping and other punishments. The expression "up the river" to describe someone in prison or heading to prison derives from the practice of sentencing people convicted in New York City to serve their terms in Sing Sing, which is located up the Hudson River. The New York Prison Association became interested in rehabilitation and humane treatment of prisoners. In 1944, the strictly silent practice in prison was overturned, and social engagement was introduced with a concern for the future rather than dwelling on the criminal's past. Now, in some instances, this assassin, his real name, I believe, is McCumber, but in this, newspaper article, they call him McCrumber. That almost sounds like a more fitting name for him. McCrumber, the murderer of George C. Willard, escaped from Mineral Point Jail. A reward of $100 has been offered by 3 citizens of Iowa County for his apprehension. It is probable that the reward will be increased by the acting governor. And it just so happens the acting governor was the victim's uncle. Prior to the murder, McCumber had threatened the life of the victim as well as the lives of the whole family of Willards. 2 weeks before the murder, he showed up at the home of George C. Shattuck, the father of Aurelia. McCumber was angry and complained about his stepson living with George Willard, and also expressed his hatred for Willard. George Shattuck attempted to neutralize the situation and tried to persuade him to take up honest work, as opposed to the thievery. McCumber said that the other work was too difficult. Before riding off, he threatened that one of us will be dead, referring to himself or George Willard. In 1837, Governor Dodge offered a $200 reward for the fugitive, described as about 25 years old, which I think he actually was, maybe they decided a little bit older than that, about 5'9", heavy built, sandy complexion, dark reddish beard, blue eyes, and hair inclined to curl. It is said that his back is much scarified, and that one of his hips is branded with the letter D, his punishment for desertion in the Army. The Army in earlier years used corporal punishment, no matter how small the offense. He was found and arrested in 1839, so he must have been on the run for like 1 to 2 years. and it's assumed that he was finally convicted and hung in 1840. So I was kind of curious about the boy then that the Willards were trying to protect. So this is him, George McClay. So George W. McClay was the stepson of McUmber, and he was born in New York City, the son of Moses McClay and Margaret Ewing. His widowed mother, with at least 6 children by McClay, married McUmber in 1834. In 1835, George McClay took refuge with the George Clark Willard family. At the time of the murder, George McClay's siblings were Margaret, age 16, John, age 10, Agnes, 8, and Jane, 4. In 1936, his sister was born, and she was a McUmber. And in 1836, McUmber murders George Clark Willard. At age 36, George McClay married Martha Pierpoint in Grant County, Wisconsin. They moved to Humboldt, Iowa in 1865, and later to Clay County, Iowa. George died in Clay County, Iowa in 1899. So I was kind of glad to see that, this boy that they saved, basically, that he did go on to, live a good life. Pictured are Aurelia's in-laws, Alexander and Eleanor Willard. The old man looked around. Things were getting very settled. The farmland was cleared. Roads crossed the land. There was talk of railroads everywhere. Steamboats regularly passed on the river. He was 74 years old now, but still tough enough and spry enough to dream of the distant shore he would lead his family to, California. His son was there, and gold continued to flow from the land. He decided to sell out, leave Platteville, and join a wagon train bound for the far west. Some of those leaving Old Grant were headed for Oregon, and some for California. He was confident that he could make it, and God knew he had seen much more rugged traveling. He had been west many years ago. He had been one of the first Americans to see the Pacific Northwest. In 1804, he signed on with the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Corps of Discovery, favorite project of President Jefferson, who had just completed the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson wanted to know what the new nation had bought. The old man had suffered more than most by his own failings, but he had persevered. He was the only member of the Corps of Discovery captured by the camera's lens. For more than 20 years, he had lived in southwest Wisconsin, first in Elk Grove and then in Platteville. He had been happy farming the land, a new citizen of a new territory, just one of many citizens. His name was Alexander Hamilton Willard. He was born in Charleston, New Hampshire, in August 28, 1778. So he was born exactly 240 years before me. By 1800, he had moved west to Kentucky. On June 9, 1800, he joined the United States Army. His induction papers showed him as a blacksmith. It was in this routine and inglorious service of the nation as an Army private that his opportunity to intersect with history occurred. He was physically strong and handy with his hands. He knew ironwork, gun repair, and a little carpentry. He was an accomplished hunter. In short, he was the kind of man that would be needed to get the expedition up the long rivers and over the endless plains and mountains that entailed the massive West. He was enlisted in Captain Amos Stoddar's artillery company at Fort Fayette, which is modern Pittsburgh. He went west when Stoddard's company was assigned to Fort Kaskaskia, near Ellis Grove, Illinois. In November 1803, Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark arrived to recruit troops for the expedition. 11 men were recruited from Fort Kaskaskia, 6 from the infantry company commanded by Captain Russell Bissell, and 5 from the artillery company commanded by Captain Amos Stoddard. Willard joined the Corps of Discovery in 1804, serving 2.5 years as the youngest member of the expedition. He was a valuable member. He was proficient in handling a canoe in the white water and high waves. He served as a blacksmith, gunsmith, and hunter. In old age, Willard boasted that his fine physique enabled him to pass the inspection for enlistment in the expedition that more than 100 had failed. Willard married Eleanor MacDonald in 1807. In 1808, Meriwether Lewis hired him as a blacksmith to the Sauk and Fox Indians, and the following year, he was hired at the same job to the Delaware and Shawnee. In 1852, the Willard family immigrated west to California, where he died in Sacramento. On May 14, 1804, the second expedition commenced. The story of the hardships and triumphs of the Corps of Discovery are well known. Many articles and books recounted the story at its bicentennial, which were justly celebrated as an extraordinary feat. A feat requiring, as Stephen Ambrose's book title trumpeted, undaunted courage. Despite his accomplishment, Alexander Hamilton Willard is not generally known or celebrated in Grant and Lafayette counties, where he resided from 1827 to 1852, 25 years. Perhaps this is because he did not promote himself or his feats. A year later, a grandson, Austin J. Willard, wrote to an inquirer, "I would not give a penny to have every man, woman, and child in America know that I was a grandson of one of the men who went with Lewis and Clark. I would not give a fig to know if I was the great-grandson of Simon Willard or anyone else. Grandfather crossed the plains in 1852, had no trouble with Indians or any adventure worth relating. To those who have viewed even dimly the panorama of his life, such an attitude is unfathomable. Perhaps his grandson felt, as his grandfather apparently did, that greatness is not inherited, it is earned." Here is how Alexander earned his. He and George Drouillard, the chief scout, were the primary hunters who went to shoot game needed to feed the members of the expedition. He was good with horses and responsible for their care. He did many things well, but he did have several mishaps. He was a young man, like many of the others, and they abused the whiskey. As a soldier on a military venture, he had to take his turn at guarding the camp while the others slept. And on July 12, 1804, in present-day Kansas, a sergeant found him asleep while on duty. This was potentially a capital offense punishable by death, because failure to keep guard could have resulted in the death of all. The captains convened a court-martial. Willard pled guilty of lying down and not guilty of going to sleep. The verdict was guilty, but death was not the sentence. He was sentenced to 100 lashes over 4 consecutive days. A punishment so awful, he could well have died, but he didn't. And in a quote from this Undaunted Courage book by Stephen Ambrose, "One shudders at the thought of Willard's back after the 4th day. One shudders at the thought of what might have happened had a roving band of Sioux come up while Willard was sleeping on guard duty." In August, he left a tomahawk at the previous night's encampment and was ordered to go back and retrieve it. On the way back, he lost hold of his rifle and it sank into the deep water. He couldn't swim, so a man named Reuben Field was sent in to dive and retrieve it. Willard didn't give up. He didn't bury himself in bitterness. He grew up and he did better. Soon he was trusted to negotiate purchases with the natives. He walked with the others. He nearly starved with the others. And he carried loads in long portages where the rivers were impassable. While hunting, he was attacked and almost caught by a grizzly bear, which chased him almost into the camp. In the winter of 1804-1805, he used his blacksmithing skills to make iron weapons to trade to the Mandan for food. In Montana, in August of 1805, Clark named Willard's Creek after him. 60 years later, it was renamed Grasshopper Creek. In early February 1806, Willard cut his knee badly while butchering elk, but like all the others, he had to keep moving. By the end of that month, he had taken with fever and remained ill and weak until the end of March, but he still had to travel onward. He continued to hunt and bargain with the Native Americans along the way for food. In late August of 1806, he was swept into a raging river in his canoe during a thunderstorm and almost drowned. Despite these hardships, he and his men collected samples of the unique plants and animals of the West for Jefferson's collection. In September of 1806, they were finally back from the long voyage. Lewis and Clark were treated like national heroes. The men of the expedition got double pay, $166.66 for Alexander, and 300 acres of bounty land. Most now had to kick up the pursuit of ordinary men and make a living. It is reported that the journal Willard was said to have kept during the exploration was actually destroyed by accident. So he was one of 7 doing journals. In 1806, Willard took up residence in St. Genevieve, Missouri, where Henry Dodge, future territorial governor and senator from Wisconsin, was a deputy sheriff under his father. On Valentine's Day, Alexander Willard married Eleanor McDonald of Shelbyville, Kentucky. Eleanor was the younger sister of Christina Dodge, wife of Henry Dodge. And of course, he played, such a big part in Wisconsin's history. Alexander and Eleanor had either 12 or 13 children. They had for sure 5 daughters and 7 sons. And as you can see, their third born is George Clark Willard, who was the one that married Aurelia. Henry Dodge, who was appointed governor of the original territory of Wisconsin, is shown. In 1800, at age 18, he married Christina McDonald, a girl of 15 who lived a few miles west of St. Louis. She was destined to bear him many children. 5 years later, he succeeded his father as sheriff of the Genevieve district. Dodge rose to prominence during the Black Hawk War of 1832. As the colonel of the Western Michigan Territory Militia, Dodge brought a credible fighting force into being in a very short time. More than 15 forts, fortified homes, and blockhouses sprang up almost overnight. Willard bought land in Missouri and kept in touch with William Clark. He was a personal friend and neighbor of Clark's for several years in St. Louis. In June 1807, Clark wrote the following to General Dearborn, the Secretary of War. "Sir, the Saukees wish to be furnished with a blacksmith. One has offered to go to the nation, who is a farmer, in this neighborhood," and of course they're speaking of Willard, "with a large family. He performed these duties, and on July 1st, 1809, was employed by Clark as a blacksmith for the Shawnees and Delaware." Alexander is said to have participated in the Indian War of 1811 with Tecumseh. In 1812, when the Winnebago Ho-Chunk were threatening hostilities, Willard served Clark as an express agent from St. Louis to Prairie du Chien at serious risk to his life. Clark wrote the Secretary of War, "The views and intentions of those bands of Indians whom we have suspected were hostilely inclined are no longer to be doubted. The Winnebagos are determined for war." On the 8th, instant a party of that nation, they put here Winnebagese, but some of whom were known, fired on my express, and he's referring to Alexander Willard, about 40 miles above the settlements, who on his return from Prairie du Chien, the mines in Fort Madison, and then on the 9th, an American family of women and children were killed on the banks of the Mississippi just a few minutes before Willard passed through there. So he came up upon that site. So that in part, led to this Black Hawk War. Between 1825 and 1827, Willard moved from Missouri to Illinois. He stayed there but a short time, and in 1827, moved to land near Elk Grove, Wisconsin. He purchased and cleared land for himself and his sons. When the Black Hawk War broke out in 1832, he and 4 of his sons served in the militia. Alexander Hamilton Ward and his wife suffered many losses. Their daughter, Nancy Adeline Willard Feathers, died during the wagon train while traveling west at age 35. And then, of course, George Willard Clark, the husband of Aurelia, was murdered, as mentioned earlier. June 6, 1836, headline, "Senseless Death of George Clark Willard." A letter written to the Galena Northwestern Gazette explained it. The assassin, one Lyndon B. McCumber, came to the house of the deceased, armed with a large club for the purpose of taking away a son of his wife, whom they had entreated Mr. Willard to take and bring up as an act of charity, being utterly unable to provide for their family, honestly or otherwise, as the whole neighborhood can testify. Mr. Willard took him under his protection and treated him as a son. The boy had been living with him since last fall, during which time McCumber had once taken him forcibly from Mr. Willard for the purpose of carrying on more extensively his pilfering in the county. But the youth refused to aid or abet him in this dishonest career, for which he received an unmerciful beating, and then he fled to that friend whom he knew was ever ready to protect and defend him. Mr. Willard was absent when McCumber came to the house and demanded his stepson from Mrs. Willard. And while he was searching for him, Mr. Willard came home. McCumber refused to go away, and being armed as stated with the club, Mr. Willard stepped back into the house to get his gun to defend himself and save the boy. And McCumber had actually sold him into slavery, his stepson. Seeing McCumber riding toward the spot where the youth lay concealed in the field, he mounted his horse to follow him, but McCumber, perceiving that he was being pursued, returned and encountered Mr. Willard and struck him with a blow to the left arm with the club. Mr. Willard, having considered the sight of the gun as sufficient protection, was thus disabled in that arm, and having been wounded severely through the right of the wrist, for the wrist of the right hand from the war, he could grasp nothing strongly in that hand. So McCumber was easily able to get the gun away from him and ran off with it. Mr. Willard pursued him and came up to him at the diggings of Mr. Stewart. He didn't have any firearms, he just had a small dead stick. He repeatedly asked McCumber to lay down his gun and go away, and that he would not harm him. But McCumber advanced upon Mr. Willard, and said, "Stand off or I will shoot you." And then he passed on 200 paces farther. Mr. Willard was still riding in pursuit, struck him with that dead stick he was carrying, but it wasn't enough to inflict a blow. And then at this point, they were partially hidden from witnesses by an intervening ridge, and then a gunshot was heard. McUmbert was seen running from the spot on foot. Mr. Stewart hastened to the place where lay weltering in his blood this noble, generous man, the pride of his family, a darling and idolized son, brother, and husband, thus torn from his beloved wife and babes. He had fallen from his horse, having been shot through the head. Mr. Stewart stated that he was speechless and suffering the agonies of death when he left him to search for the assassin, in the company of Mr. R.R. Willard, who forbore to shoot him when he discovered him, choosing rather to deliver McUmbert over to the laws of the country, although he had just witnessed the dying struggles of his beloved brother. Thus basely murdered without the slightest means of defense, so died one of Alexander's sons. But life requires stoic determination to persevere, so Alexander went on. Between 1844 and 1850, he sold land to his sons, establishing them as farmers, and moved to Platteville. The Bad Axe Massacre was a massacre of Sauk and Fox Indians by the United States Army regulars and militia that occurred August 1st through the 2nd in 1832. This final scene of the Black Hawk War took place near present-day Victory, Wisconsin. George Clark Willard was injured at the Battle of Bad Axe, losing the use of his right hand, so that's why he was not able to hold on to that gun and defend himself. Alexander H. Willard, then in his 50s, enrolled in Captain DeLong's company, Iowa Militia, beginning June 3, 1832. In 1849, youngest child, so this would be, his name is Louis Augustus Willard, crossed the plains with a few hardy spirits in the forefront of the Great Gold Rush. Returning east across the isthmus a little later, he again crossed the plains in 1852 with a great train, in which his father's family and many relatives. Willard, the father, decided to go to California too. He had heard of the gold fields and the growing wealth and opportunity of that new land, and he was determined to sell his land, organize an ox-drawn wagon train, and go. In 1852, 74-year-old Alexander, with his wife, some of his children and their families, and others, prepared a train of 49 people and left Platteville for the Sacramento Valley of California. He applied for more Black Hawk War bounty land in California. He eventually owned land in Lake County and Yolo County near Sacramento, and in 1860, he was valued at $8,000 for his land, and his personal property $2,000. I don't know what that equates, but I think that's quite a bit for that time. In early 1865, Alexander wrote his son Joel and said he could not do the work and did not feel he would live much longer. He died in 1865 at age 87. He left behind a widow that was 78. They had been married 58 years, and living at the time of his death, 4 sons and 2 daughters, and many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So Alexander Hamilton Willard is buried in California, and California landmark 657 is for his grave. In 1943, the Mountain Democrat and Placerville Republican of California carried an article headed, "Franklin's Pioneer Willard Trekked 3,000 Miles with Sacagawea." It reported that very little is known about the early settlement by folk now living there. They merely tell that the old folk have died off who knew anything about it. Mrs. Smith, widow of the town, was born in 1872. She admits she knows nothing about the whereabouts of the pioneers. When she learned that the grave of Alexander Willard had been outside her front door for the 70 years that she had lived there, she was flabbergasted. One ventures to say that before a fortnight has passed, the whole town of Franklin will journey out their back doors to read the dimly outlined letters. Alexander H. Willard, died March 6, 1865, age 87. We in southwest Wisconsin seem to remember even less of this man and his life than they had in California. Since the 1943 article, the state of California has designated his grave as a landmark, and a plaque is there to remind the occasional visitor of who this man was and what he did. Perhaps we should take a few steps to memorialize him for those who occasionally come here in the future, looking for the shadows of a man who showed the spirit of our young country and the things that he did. So for people that are wanting to visit, there are listed directions for finding this. And the listed directions are Franklin Cemetery, Franklin, California. And someone responded with this annotation, "That's pretty darn vague." The cemetery is 200 feet west of the intersection of Hood Franklin Road and Franklin Boulevard. The grave marker is in the northwest region of the cemetery. So he found it, but a little bit of difficulty. Okay, so now we're back to the Paytons. So this is Aurelia's, the second husband. Stephen Payton's parents were Stephen and Nancy Dottie Payton. She was a Mayflower descendant, and they were born in Virginia. And Nancy is buried, so Stephen's mother is buried in Indiana. George Clark Willard, now we're back to her first. It's kind of hard to, kind of jumping around here, but married Aurelia Shattuck in 1834. George Clark Willard was named after William Clark, the leader of the Lewis and Clark Four Discovery. His father found William Clark to be a fair and decent man, as opposed to William's partner, Meriwether Lewis. They were the parents of Ralph Clark Willard and Hamilton Alexander Willard. So those would be the grandchildren of the explorer. When 15 years old, Ralph Clark Willard was living in Otter Creek with his mother, stepfather, and siblings. He was just 20 years old when his mother died. In 1860, at age 25, he was living with his uncle, Monroe Shattuck, so it would be his mother's brother, in Monterey, California, and working as a miner. In 1881, he was farming in Canada. 13 years later, he was working as a miner at Ashcroft Station in British Columbia. And then 4 years later, he was listed as an engineer. And he was working at the ferry, and he was receiving $60 a month, which again, that seems like quite a good amount of money. He died in British Columbia. Ashcroft Station, where he was working, there are 2 lakes are named after 2 early ranching families who settled there. And so this is named for the Willard family. Hamilton Alexander Willard, named after his grandfather, Alexander Hamilton Willard, so the first and the middle name are switched around, was born in Elk Grove Township, Wisconsin. And at age 24, he was living in Nevada, California, working as a bricklayer. He was later a miner. He married in 1872 and had 3 daughters and 1 son. And then in 1910, he was living in Washington. was widowed at the time and working as a brick mason. And then he died in Washington in 1915. Okay, so now we're back to Aurelia with her second husband. Aurelia married Stephen Payton in 1840 in Joe Davies County, Illinois. And 2 years later, they were living next door to her parents in Galena, Illinois, the Shaddocks. They had moved there after their son, Samuel Lee Payton, had been born. Stephen was working as a miner. 3 or 4 of her sons became miners like her husband. Now, this again, Stephen Payton, Aurelia's second husband. So, after she died, he remarried Maria or Mariah. When Maria married Stephen in 1856, Aurelia's children, here's what their ages were: 15, 14, 12, 8, 6, and 2. So Stephen's second wife had 3 children, and those ages were 6, 5, and 2. So she had to care for 9 children, ranging from 2 years to 15 years old. In 1862, she sued for divorce due to Stephen's violence when intoxicated. He threatened to kill her with a knife, and she feared for her life. The divorce did not go through because Stephen enlisted in the war and got killed. He enlisted at age 52 in Grant County, Wisconsin. It has been speculated that he wanted to get killed. He was mortally wounded December of that same year at the Battle of Prairie Grove and is buried in an unmarked grave in Fayetteville National Cemetery in Arkansas. At the time of Stephen's death, the children's ages would have been 21, 20, 17, 14, 12, 12, 10, 8, and 8. Stephen drank heavily during his first marriage also and abused his first wife, Aurelia, both mentally and physically when he was intoxicated. So, Stephen Payton's second wife, Maria, was 20 years old when she married John Hunter, so she was married prior to marrying Stephen. Her first husband was 27 years older than she was, so she was widowed at age 31 and had 3 children, although one was a child that her first husband had had. So the child that Maria's first husband had was Philip J. Hunter. And in the 1860 census, the only reason I'm mentioning him is because in the 1860 census, he was living in Clay County, Iowa, in Millville. I don't know if many of you know where Millville is. And there, in the census records, there's a G. Payton, age 10, living there. And so he was raising his stepmother's stepson. You know, I just think that's pretty amazing. You know, he would do that then. Philip's mother died in 1844 when he was just 15, the same year that his father married Maria Hunter. Philip was a father of 11 children with his wife, Mary Ann Lady. He did not remarry after her death in 1881. In 1910, he was living in Custer, South Dakota. And then in 1920, he was back to Delaware County, Iowa. He died in Clayton County, Iowa. His occupation was farmer and bricklayer. So these people all throughout this, they just traveled. So they lived in so many states over their lifetime. Maria Paul Hunter married Stephen in 1856. Maria Payton, the widow of Stephen Payton, applied for a military bounty and Civil War widow's pension while living in Dubuque. Stephen had served with the Wisconsin Volunteers. She gave her husband's date of death as December 9, 1862. She declared she was Stephen's second wife and that she and Stephen had no children together. Stephen and his first wife had 6 children, which she named in the application. She further stated at the time of Stephen's death the children's names and the ages. George and Scott were the 2 minors, at the time of his death. Now in the 1960 census, which is 2 years before Stephen was killed in the war, he doesn't show up with his second wife. So they were living apart for several years before he decided to enlist. Aurelia's daughter, Mary Ann Peyton Bratz, lived in Iowa and had 11 children. She moved to Scott County shortly after her marriage and then later to Hardin County, Iowa, where she died at age 41. Aurelia's son, Samuel Lee Peyton, enlisted in Company C, 2nd Infantry, Wisconsin. He was wounded at Manassas. He then enlisted Company B, Iowa, 12th Infantry. He had 2 daughters, Maud Aurelia and Pearl, who remained in the Millville area. Aurelia's son, Samuel, was a minor stonemason who lived in the Millville area of Clayton County and was eventually killed by a dynamite blast at Cassville, Wisconsin. Aurelia's daughter, Caroline, lived in Millville, Iowa, with her husband and 2 sons. Caroline was born in Dubuque County, Iowa. She died at age 75 in 1919 and is buried in Idaho. Okay, so I looked up how to pronounce that name. I thought it would be pronounced different, but it's Leonidas. Aurelia's son, Leonidas, spent time as a miner in Nevada. Leonidas served in the Civil War. At age 12, he most likely was living with individuals that were unrelated, because at the time, you know, his parents, or his mother was deceased. At the age of 16, he enlisted in Wisconsin Company F. He spent time as a miner in Nevada. Leonidas was not found on the 1860 census. After the war, there was no home for him to return to. He went to the home of his oldest sister. Her husband's niece lived next door. The niece, Elizabeth Caroline Kossel, was just 15, and her father had just been killed in the Civil War. So 16-year-old Elizabeth and Leonidas were married in December, the year after the war ended. Leonidas may have been named after politician Leonidas Metcalf, who was from Kentucky, which that family had been from Kentucky. Pictures shown of Aurelia's husband, Stephen, and their son, Leonidas. So Leonidas, the 4th born, he evidently made some poor choices regarding his family, and I had been conferring actually with descendants of this family back 25 years ago when I came across some of their letters, and they said they didn't talk about the Peytons. That was just like, they didn't talk about him at all. And I don't think they knew, you know, about the murders and the beatings. I don't think that they knew all of those things. But Leonidas, after his first wife died, he took his son with him, and he just abandoned his 2 daughters. And they were under the age of 10, Catherine and Mary. And so Catherine is related then to the people that I corresponded with. He said he moved south because of his health, which had been ruined by his Army service. So he was widowed at age 32. And in 1880, he was living alone in Mississippi. He had left his children with other people and had moved to Mississippi. The second wife he married, they divorced. And his 3rd wife died the same year they married. Leonidas is buried in Arkansas in an unmarked grave. But you can kind of see how maybe his life turned out the way it was. His mother dying so young, and you know, his father having abused. He probably abused the children too, I would imagine. So this is Aurelia's granddaughter and Leonidas' daughter. Catherine Aurelia Katie Peyton Kuhn was Leonidas' daughter and Aurelia's granddaughter. Her grandson was a lieutenant in the infantry in World War II, a University of Iowa graduate, and served as district manager for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and vice president of the Washington, D.C. Board of Trade. So after her mother had died and her father had moved away, 12-year-old Katie was listed on the census as being a servant in Millville, Iowa, for the Preston family. Then later, at age 15, she was raised in the home of Dr. Hoyt in Dutchtown, Iowa, which is northeast of Manchester. She later married a farmer, George A. Coote, and lived near Manchester, Iowa, where they raised 3 sons. Her younger sister, Mary, moved to Oregon, married, and raised 1 daughter and 5 sons. One of these sons may have been killed in World War I. As told by family members, Catherine's boys were sitting in a tree when an old man appeared under the tree. He asked if they knew where Katie Coon lived. The boys said that she was their mother. The old man replied, "Well then, I guess I must be your grandpa." The grandfather stayed with them for a few days and they never saw him again. It is speculated that although he abandoned his daughter as a young child, she may have understood why that had happened. Her father was just 7 years old when his mother died and 14 years old when his father died. Peyton was named for George Washington Peyton, Aurelia's son, an early settler of the town. Originally called Mayfield, the settlement was renamed Peyton. Peyton is an unincorporated town, a post office, located in and governed in El Paso County, Colorado. The 2020 population, the census, was 214. George Washington Peyton was born in Jackson County and died in Boise, Idaho. The Peyton family was one of royalty, dating back in France before the Norman conquest. Aurelia's son, Scott Peyton, was born in Jackson County. He died in Redding, California, and is buried in Colorado. He was just 1 year old when his mother died. He may have also lived in Peyton. So Aurelia's maiden name, Shattuck. The Shattuck family was from England. The first to arrive was William's 5th great-grandfather at age 17. Her great-grandfather died from smallpox. His son Samuel had contracted it in the French and Indian War. Her grandfather, Major William Shattuck, served in the Revolutionary War. Governor George Clinton and the Assembly of New York granted William and other land grants for their pain and suffering. William was granted 3,200 acres. Major William Shattuck died when he was thrown from his horse while in Canada. Aurelia's father, George, served under Colonel Henry Dodge. So his future son-in-law's uncle, basically, at the stockade in Darlington, Wisconsin. Her father was one of the first white settlers in what is now Waukon. He staked 640 acres. Over his lifetime, he was a surveyor, teacher, carpenter, soldier, lead miner, and farmer. Her grandfather, Major William Shattuck, was a private in the Revolutionary War and a first major in the New York militia. Now this I had never heard of before, but he was involved in the Civil War between New York and Vermont, 1782 to 1786. Aurelia's parents were George Clinton Shattuck and Anne Bronson, parents of 11 children. George Clinton Shattuck was named after Governor George Clinton of New York. He taught school in New York, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. He was in the Winnebago War in 1827. Hostilities occurred due to settlers mining on Indian land. In 1827, George helped build the first frame house in Galena. He assisted with the founding of Waukon, and he and his family were the first white settlers to settle there.
George and Ann's daughter, Sophia Shattuck Seeley, was the wife of a Wisconsin legislature. Their daughter, Caroline, was married to Private Robert S. Stevenson. After Caroline died, Robert married Caroline's sister, Minerva. Private Robert Stevenson was killed in Antietam on September 17, 1862. In the very early morning at the beginning of the day's battle in the cornfield, he had been ill and left the field hospital when he heard the cannons. Under protest from the staff to join the conflict, he remarked to his captain upon seeing him in the field, "Captain, I am with you at last." William Pitt Shattuck, Aurelia's brother, pictured on left. On right, his wife, Dr. Janetta Rosetta Nettie Mackenzie. Nettie practiced medicine in both Minnesota and California. She dedicated her life to helping the sick and the poor. Her husband, William Pitt Shattuck, was killed during the Dakota Uprising in Minnesota in 1862. She never remarried. Her only son, William Pitt II, remained in Minnesota and became a prominent citizen of Minneapolis. William Pitt assisted in founding the town of Waukon, Iowa, and he donated 34 acres for the center of town. August 15, 1862, William Pitt with others went on a trapping expedition just before the Dakota Uprising occurred. He and his party explored the river and planned to stay a few months trapping. They were totally unaware of the Dakota Uprising. Fort Abercrombie was first attacked on August 1862 and again September 3rd and 6th. News spread about the murders. Settlers fled. Indians spread out above and below Old Army Road, plundering settler homes. And in 1862, Army convoy traveling down the Old Army Road had an Indian scare from a small band of Indians, but there was no attack. So Alexandria is about 18 miles southwest, where Pitt and his party were trapping. After checking his traps, he found 2 Dakota Indians raiding his cache. He was ambushed, scalped while still alive, and killed at age 31. His body was pushed under the ice before the 2 Indians involved escaped to Canada. His brother, Scott Shattuck, learns of his death, and he was with the Iowa Regiment at the time, and he requested to be reassigned. So he changed to the Iowa Cavalry because they were to fight the Dakota Indians. Pitt's body could not be recovered during the expedition and was recovered after the ice had thawed. This is his son, William Pitt Shattuck II, and he was a famous inventor. Among some of the things he invented, in 1892, the climbing monkey on a string that's shown there, and in 1902, a calculator, in 1925, a clothes wringer. And then this is their son, their only son, William Pitt Shattuck III, so Aurelia's great nephew, was the former chief counsel of the Subcommittee on Administrative Law and Governmental Relations, U.S. House Judiciary, well, I can't say that word, committee. So I know that was a lot of information. I probably should have left some out. But it's just all of these things, you know, that with this family and all the losses and, you know, all the wars that they were in, it's just, and what a tragic life that Aurelia led, and, you know, having all these family members killed. Anyone have any questions? Yes.
Did Vermont win that Civil War?
No.
I never heard of it either.
Actually, I know.
You do?
In the Revolutionary War, they were fighting the Battle of Champlain, Lake Champlain. There's a variety of islands. Okay, the biggest battle happened off Alcor Island. That's close to New York. Lake Champlain is the 6th largest freshwater body we have in the United States, as far as lakes. what happened is New York was fighting Vermont because Vermont was going to be the 14th state. They were trying to define where the boundaries of the state were through the various islands that were in Lake Champlain. Vermont actually succeeded in acquiring most of the islands because if you drain the lake, the channel runs to the west of most of those, and ultimately it was a court decision that gave those islands to Vermont. So yeah, that's what it was about. I was stationed last Air Force Base and have a son living up there. It's the only reason I know this.
Will you take us back to the beginning now? Aurelia is buried in Jackson County,
In Sweezy Cemetery.
and that is up in the Otter Creek area?
Can you hear? Okay. So Aurelia is buried in Sweezy Cemetery, which is 3 miles south of the Otter Creek Station, or 7, 8 miles north on Highway 61. There's a little white fence around it, and what was it, 30 years ago we were working in that cemetery, and hers was one of 40 stones that were buried, like, I can't remember, hers was 1 foot or 2 foot underground. Whether that was purposely buried or if they ran animals through there, I don't know. And we always thought her stone was just so beautiful. And when I was trying to get information about her and all the people in the cemetery, how they were related, but she was the only one there. It said wife of Stephen Payton. And I kind of wondered, like, what happened to her husband? Why wasn't he buried there? Why weren't there any children there? And I'm not sure her stone is in the right place. When we had the tornado that hit our farm, I can't remember what year that was now, 30 years ago, or no, 25 years ago. It damaged that stone. I see now it's been put somewhere, but I don't know if that's, I'm not sure if it's the right place or not.
So, maybe others know. So your farm is on that cemetery property, and
Well, it kind of adjoins it, and we do have a lot of family buried there. The Mayberries are buried there. But I was just always kind of fascinated with, wondering about, her. And then I had all that correspondence from her granddaughter-in-law, I believe, who is now like 96, maybe. And so I can't really talk to her, anymore, ask her any questions. But we corresponded back and forth in 1999, I believe.
are you related at all to?
I don't believe we're related to this family at all. But most of the families there originated from Mercer County, Pennsylvania. And they had a connection to each other. With her, I've not really found a connection. But other than she would have been living, she was living in a farm.
Have you seen anything that our John Henry Weber, who was in that territory, was there any connection with them, or was he earlier, do you know?
I don't know.
Maybe he was earlier.
I'm not sure.
Just want to check.
But I just was quite fascinated then to know that, a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, his grandchildren, were living in Jackson County, probably right near where we live somewhere.
He was probably earlier. We're always looking for facts about John Henry Weber because there's so much we don't know about his later life. He was probably earlier.
And again, I'm just amazed at the travel, all of this traveling, these people, that was dangerous, to people relocating at that time. But they were adventurers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
I'm starting to make them shorter. You notice this is fewer slides.